there, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm sharing one of the cards I created using some of the new Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous 2024 Christmas stamps and that Tim featured during his YouTube Live. I used my all-time favorite technique, stamp and smudge, to create it. So grab your Distress Oxide inks, some stamps, and follow along with me. As always, I encourage you to use supplies that you already own. However, if you're interested in any of the products I'm using, you can find the supply list with links in the description box below. Click on the word more to see more. When you shop through those links, you're supporting me at no extra cost to you, and I really appreciate that so very much. So for this card, I'm going to be working with the new Santa Visit stamp set from Tim Holtz and Stampers Anonymous, which is part of the Christmas 2024 release. And if you know me at all, you know I love Christmas and I love Santas. In fact, I actually have quite a Santa collection. And so when I saw this stamp set in the Santa, I knew I had to create something with this and kind of have Santa as the focal point on the card. I am going to be adding some other stamps to work with here, and I just kind of went through my stash and picked out a few stamp sets that had some stamps in them that I felt kind of coordinated with kind of the theme I wanted to go with here. And I was really inspired by this postcard stamp here and the little note from Santa, so I just kind of wanted to continue with that kind of postal theme. So this little stamp here and the cancellation image from this Christmas nostalgia stamp set. There's also the vintage holiday stamp set, which has this special delivery and some other little stamps here. And I'm also going to add in this little filler stamp. And then also another stamp set that you could use would be this stamp collector stamp set. It's got tons of different stamp images on there, so that's another option. And then I also have the holiday Postmarks stamp set that I'm going to be working with. So go through your stash. He's got lots of stamp sets that kind of have that postal theme, even, you know, kind of sprinkled throughout other stamp sets. So you could go through your stash and find something that will work. And again, with this card, as with all of my cards, if you don't have this exact stamp set or any of these exact stamp sets, these techniques can be done with any stamps you have. So feel free to just grab some stamps and play along. So some of the other supplies I'm going to be working with are Distress Oxide ink, and the colors I've got here are Rustic, Wilderness, Lumberjack, Plaid, Old Paper, Mowed Lawn, and Ground Espresso. And then I'm going to be doing some stamping with archival ink and black soot. And for this one, you can you definitely want the oxide inks. You could also probably do pigment inks if you have just a different brand and you have pigment inks because of the technique. And then I'm going to be doing some coloring in of the stamped image, so you'll want some sort of permanent ink. So here I'm using archival ink and black soot, and then I'm going to be coloring that image in using Distress watercolor pencils and just a variety of colors here. I've got Rustic Wilderness, Lost Shadow, Lumberjack Plaid, Tumble Glass, Wild Honey, Black Soot, Tattered Rose, Fossilized Amber, Gathered Twigs, Ground Espresso, and Spun Sugar. And that's all just to kind of color in that Santa image, so you could certainly pick whatever colors you like there. If you don't have the Distress watercolor pencils, you could use colored pencils, you could use any kind of watercolor pencils. You could also use Distress inks or Distress reinkers and just put some of the ink onto your craft mat and use a brush with some water to pick up that ink and color in. So just some options there for you. And then the other thing I'm going to do is add some splatters using the foundry wax and gilded. And to do that, you're going to need just a little bit of a 91% isopropyl rubbing alcohol. And last but not least, the paper I'm going to be working with is Distress watercolor cardstock. You want the watercolor cardstock for sure if you're going to do the watercoloring for the stamped image. And you could use any paper that you could do ink blending on for the background if you prefer. So if you've got like some Distress heavy stock or some other kind of smooth white cardstock, because we're not going to be doing any wet mediums, it's just going to be inking and stamping. So you've got a little bit of flexibility for what kind of paper you want to use on the background. So to get started, I'm going to be working in my stamping platform. You could also do the stamping with a stamping block if you prefer. I'm going to be putting a little bit of this temporary adhesive here in the center of my stamping platform. I cut a piece of black cardstock to fit in here instead of using the paper grid sheets. I just find this a little bit more durable than those. And then I can kind of put my paper here in the center and work around that as I'm creating the background. I'm going to be doing one of my favorite techniques, which is the stamp and smudge. And I've shared this multiple times over the time I've been doing videos. And when I'm doing this sort of stamping, I always like to kind of lay out my stamped design a little bit so that I kind of get a feel for how all the different images will fill out the paper, and it also lets me kind of think about where I want what colors. So for the stamp and smudge, I'm going to be using Mowed Lawn, Lumberjack Plaid, and Rustic Wilderness, and a little bit of old paper. And I like to, like I said, kind of like to plan out a little bit where I'm going to put the different images and then decide what color I want to do those images. And I kind of think about things like in a little bit of a triangle so that things are kind of helping keep the color spread across the background and kind of keeps your eye moving across the background. So here, like I said, just kind of playing around a little bit with the stamp positioning here and thinking about what images I would want where. All right, so at this point, I've got kind of got a little bit of a start here. So I'm going to be doing these images here with Mowed Lawn, and then I'm also going to repeat this stamped image down here as well, so that'll kind of help have that green through the background. And then these images I'm going to stamp with Rustic Wilderness, and then from there I'll continue kind of adding some of the Lumberjack Plaid and then add in that old paper as well. And as far as doing this, it doesn't really matter what color you start with. You can use any, start with any color that you like out of the ones that you've picked. I picked this color palette just because it's kind of more Christmas themed. So if you're doing this for a different theme, you could certainly pick different colors. So I've got the stamps here, and now I'm just going to apply some of the Oxide ink to the stamps. You're going to stamp your image. So these images are a little more detailed and fine, so I'm actually going to stamp these images twice just to get a little more ink onto the paper. And now I'm going to take my clean paper towel here, and I'm just going to kind of wipe in a circular motion and smudge that ink, hence the name Stamp and Smudge. So the more wet the ink is, the more it's going to smudge on you, which is kind of the technique here. And we'll just set those to the side and clean them later. And now we're going to continue on with the other colors. Now this image that is a little more solid is going to be probably a lot more wet. So if it seems like there's, like if you can see the ink still like there, I just dabbed it and it's pretty wet. and a lot of ink, you can kind of dab off a little bit of that excess so there's not quite that much to smudge, but it's, you know, kind of up to you and worth a play around. And then as I mentioned here, I'm going to stamp this image along this lower section here, just to kind of help carry that color around the background. Helps if you ink the right side there. And another thing I wanted to share with you is I often practice making some backgrounds and kind of laying out where I might want to do the stamps. So that's always something you can kind of practice with. And I usually do my practicing on some HP inkjet printer paper. So it's a little higher quality computer paper. It has really a nice smooth texture, and actually the Oxide inks stamp really lovely on it. So you could also just use this paper for your background if you'd like. So now I'm going to also stamp that Christmas tree, and I'm going to stamp it in the mowed lawn as well. Now I'm going to do some of the stamping with the Lumberjack Plaid to kind of fill in some of the other spaces here. And again, I've positioned these stamps so that they're kind of spreading that red across the background and keeping your eye moving across the design. And again, that one being a little more solid. And also too, like if you don't want to lose a lot of the detail, you could also kind of dab off a little bit of it as well. That's kind of a personal preference. And because I'm working on watercolor paper and the ink kind of sits on the top of the paper and dries slowly on this type of paper, you know, that you've got more ink on the paper, so it's going to smudge more or better, whichever way you want to look at it there. So if you're working on a paper that's more porous in the sense that the ink kind of dries more quickly, your ink's going to dry faster on the paper, and so you won't get as much of a smudge or have as long of amount of time to kind of wait to do the smudging. Because like a lot of times when I'm working on this watercolor paper, I can actually stamp this and play around for a little bit before I have to worry about the ink really totally drying and not being able to smudge it anymore. So here I'm just going to add a couple more little images that feel like will kind of help fill in the design. Just kind of keep filling a little bit of these open areas here. It's really just kind of about building the layers and then thinking again about where the colors are with relation to each other and kind of helping spread that design and color across the background. And so that here's still a little bit of an open area there, so I'm going to grab this image and stamp that with more of the the Rustic Wilderness. And now I'm going to take that little filler stamp I mentioned earlier, and for this I'm actually going to use a stamping block because it's just a little bit faster, and I'm going to be repeating that same image in multiple areas. And I'm just going to apply the ink to the stamp and then just kind of stamp that across the background here and there. It's not going to add a lot of color, but it just adds just a small amount of texture here and there throughout the background. And I'm not super worried about the center here because the stamped image of Santa is going to cover up some of that. But just kind of adding a little bit more interest here and there with this. So there is a look at the finished stamping that we've done. So now to continue on with the background, I'm going to do some ink blending around the edges of the paper with a little bit of ground espresso. And just using a little blending brush and working here on my glass mat and just kind of working in a little bit of a circular motion. So I like to kind of start off the mat, as you can see, and then just kind of pull that ink around the edge as I go. And then just keep working like that around the edge all the way around. If you don't want that kind of a blended effect, you could also just take the brush and just rub it along the edges, and that'll give you like a little smaller amount of color onto the background. But I just kind of wanted to give it a little bit more of a vintage effect there by kind of bringing that brown more around the paper. And now I'm going to take my Distress sprayer filled with water, and I'm just going to add a little bit of some water droplets here, slowly pulling the trigger as I do that. And I'm going to take my paper towel. You want one that's not super dirty. And then I'm just going to lay that over the top. And then I'll just kind of pick up some of that ink and add just a little tiny bit of interest to the background. It's not going to be super noticeable, but you can see just a little bit there how it kind of lightens some of those colors because we're working with the oxide inks. And this gives that another little bit of vintage distress. Now before we move on to the next step, I'm going to give this a quick dry with my heat tool. And now we're going to add some splatters using the Distress Foundry Wax in Gilded. And you just want to make sure you shake that up really well. There's a little mixing ball in there, and you just want to get that so that it's rattling. So that'll just make sure all of the pigment gets mixed in before you start working with it. If you're having a hard time getting the mixing ball to start moving, sometimes you might need to kind of tap this on your table or something to kind of bang it loose, because sometimes it'll get stuck up, up towards the top. And then, like I said, once you got that, you can hear that, then you're good to go. All right, so I'm just going to add a few drops of this to my craft mat here. A little bit of rubbing alcohol. Mix that in, and then just add the splatters. And as you can see, can't really see much. Can't even hardly tell I've done anything, but give me just a second and I will show you the magic of Foundry Wax. So once you're finished with the splatters, you can just, you'll notice that this dries pretty quickly and will just kind of eventually just kind of turn into like a powder, and you can just wipe that off, especially if you're working on a non-porous surface. And then you can just, clean your brush with a little soap and water to get that out of your brush. Now this Foundry Wax is not permanent until you apply heat to it. In fact, it doesn't even hardly show up until there's heat been applied to it. So that said, you want to make sure you get your Foundry Wax bottle out of the way, and then you're going to want to get your heat embossing gun, and then you're just going to apply that heat over the surface, and you'll see the magic happen here. And so now you can see that little bit of shimmer that's been added from the foundry wax. And if you don't have the foundry wax, another option could be maybe to use some of the spritz sprays and just tap the nozzle to add some splatters. There's lots of options. If you've got some gold paint, if you like the gold effect, you could also use the mica stains and do the same thing, pull the nozzle out and tap that to create some splatters. So yeah, just a nice little way to add a little bit of shimmer to the background. All right, so now we're going to move on to the stamping and coloring of the main image there of Santa. I'm just putting a piece of the watercolor cardstock here into my stamping platform and just going to position this image here onto the paper. And then I'm also going to stamp a couple of these extra little presents because I might use those as well. I'm just going to stamp these here with the waterproof ink. I'm using archival ink and black soot. Again, just some sort of waterproof ink. And usually the case when I'm working on the watercolor cardstock is I need to stamp it several times to get a really nice dark impression. Because this ink kind of tends to soak in pretty quick on this paper. I'm going to do one more. Now, I'm going to leave my paper here in my stamping platform because I find sometimes when working with the Distress watercolor pencils that they will kind of dull the stamped image a little bit because they're layering over the top of it with the pigment. So I'm going to do the coloring and then re-stamp this image to help make it pop out again. So I'm just going to grab a little paper towel here, and I've got all my different colors and just going to start coloring this in. I like to pull the pigment off of the watercolor pencil using my water brush. You could also use a paintbrush, and then I kind of like to just get it going a little bit. Make sure it's not going to do that on my paper. If I haven't worked with it for a little while, sometimes it's got to get kind of wake it up a little bit. And then I'm going to just start applying that color to the image. And because we're watercoloring, I don't have to be like super perfect with it. You could also, if you're into Copics, you could also color all this with your Copic markers if that's one of your preferred coloring options. And yeah, like it seems like it's a little too much, just tap that off on your craft mat or even onto your paper towel just to kind of absorb some of that excess if it feels like it's or looks like it's getting to be too much. And then now I'm just going to go back and add a little bit more into the areas that kind of have more of like the shadow, so where there's like more of the dark lines of the design. Yeah, you just kind of keep that going until you're finished coloring it in. before I go on to the next color, I often kind of just like to make sure that that layer is dry. So you could use your heat tool and just dry that a little bit if you want. And then you can go on to the next color. And then as you notice here, as I'm doing the kind of the white fur area, I'm using Lost Shadow, and I'm just using the little shadow areas that are part of the stamped image to kind of add that lost shadow over those, to just kind of add a little bit of shadow and interest to that area. And here, if you don't have the color you want, you can always mix colors. So I wanted this to have a little bit more of a gold color, so I found that by mixing fossilized amber and wild honey, kind of got more of the color I was going for his buckle. And at this point, like if there's any areas that you missed that you want to go back in and maybe add a little more, for example, like a little more of the Lumberjack plaid, just gonna get these areas a little more color to them. You can just kind of go back and add that in if you like, or you can call it done. And then once you're finished with the coloring and everything, you can, because you haven't moved the paper, or the stamp, you can re-ink your images and stamp back over this, and just kind of give you a little bit. It doesn't look bad right now, but you can kind of see where some of the detail just gets a little muted from the pigments of the watercolor pencils. Now we're just going to stamp back over that. And now you can kind of see where it's just kind of brings it back to life and just pops a little bit more now with that stamped, by restamping it. And then from here, I'm just going to take my scissors and fussy cut these images, and I'm not going to try to cut out any of these little areas that are kind of hanging over, like the little bits here on the bow that's sticking out. I'm just going to trim pretty tight to the image, just to kind of make it easier for me with the fussy cutting. And then once you have your fussy cutting complete, then you can just adhere your image to the card using whatever adhesive you like. I'm probably going to use some sort of double-sided foam adhesive just to add a little bit more depth and dimension, and then a sentiment if you like. And then I'm going to mat this background onto some other paper just to finish it off as well. So here is a look at the finished card. I added a sentiment from the Home for Christmas stamp set, but you could use any stamp set you like. And then just layered it onto a piece of white cardstock, and I inked the edges of both the sentiment strip and the background with some of the ground Espresso Distress Oxide ink. There you can see just some of that shimmer that you get from the foundry wax. There you go. So there's a look at the finished card. I hope you enjoyed seeing how this card came together using one of the new Tim Holtz Stampers Anonymous Christmas 2024 stamp sets and my favorite technique. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.